Hey, it's Courtney Barriger, your host of Environmental Style Now, the A to Z podcast on all that is sustainable fashion. On this episode of ES Now, I'm with Karyn Bischoff, Director of Analytical Toxicology at Cornell University, here to tell us how to keep our pets safe from toxic fast fashion. Hello, I'm Courtney Barriger, and this is ES Now. Today I'm with Karyn Bischoff, Director of Analytical Toxicology in the Vet Population Medicine and Diagnostic Services Department in the College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell University. Whew, that was a chew. Her research is in clinical toxicology, and she's interested in the poisoning of animals. Let's jump right in.
Hey, this is Karyn Bischoff. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Oh, I can't complain too much. I'm sitting here reading actually more about plastics, so there you have it.
Oh dear.
So where would you like to start?
Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about your background in animal toxicology?
Veterinarian first. I graduated from vet school some time ago and took all my board exams and everything like that. And then I did a couple things actually after I graduated. I did some work on wild birds for a few months in a few different places, like raptors in Minnesota and seabirds in Florida for a little while. And then I started my toxicology residency, and that's a 3-year period where I basically studied. As a veterinarian, I studied toxicology in a veterinary diagnostic lab, so we're kind of the CSI lab in the background that tells you what killed your animal, hopefully. We do a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. We do a lot of testing of samples and things like that. So if the vet takes a blood sample and says, I'm sending this to the lab to test for ABC, it might come to my lab. So that's where I started. I started in Oklahoma doing that, and I actually did some other things along the way. I'm working on a master's of public health right now in my spare time, but I still run the veterinary diagnostic toxicology lab here at Cornell, which basically is very similar to what I was doing in Oklahoma. We get samples from all over the state, all over the country, and we get a lot from around the world as well. We get a lot from Hong Kong and a lot from Brazil and some other places for testing, for either forensic testing, say, did somebody drug this horse before I bought it, to, we just had a wildlife case. We see a lot of rat poison in wildlife, unfortunately. So that was, we do that kind of thing a lot. Did my dog get into antifreeze? Did somebody poison my pet? A lot of stuff like that. So it can be a little bit depressing at the end of the day, but we also do a lot of things that save a lot of lives. So that's why we're here. And I'm involved in a lot of other organizations as well. So I'm on a local environmental safety board. I'm on the U.S. Animal Health Association's food safety board. So I do a lot of work with food safety as well. And I just kind of have my fingers in a lot of different areas. And I actually got started looking at plastic because a colleague of mine a few years ago needed somebody to speak on plastic toxicology, and I said, no, I don't have time. And after he knows me well enough that he said, okay, fine, and left, and 3 days later, I'm like, I want to speak on this. This is really interesting. So I just have a habit of being too curious for my own good, and it causes me to have to do a lot more work, but but I learn a lot of things too, so that's useful.
As you began to study plastic toxicology in animals, what have you discovered?
Well, I think everybody's seen the pictures of, the albatrosses that are on the nesting islands that are feeding big chunks of plastic to their babies because when they forage, they can't tell the difference between their normal prey and floating plastic. You've probably seen the pictures of the sea turtles that have choked on plastic bags, and you've heard all the stories about the whales that are beached and they're full of plastic. And I think there was a few years ago a really horrifying picture of a terrapin turtle that got stuck in a plastic soda ring, and it grew around the soda ring. So macro pollution, large sizes of plastic in the environment. I think when I was a kid back in the 70s, we all went and cut all our soda rings so that they wouldn't strangle ducks and things like that. So we know that plastic has caused some detrimental effects to wildlife, and we've known it for a really long time. We've known it since we were kids. Plastic really wasn't a big thing before the 1950s. So it's kind of crazy now when you think about it, that, it was less than 100 years ago that people did not have plastic in their house. The phone I'm talking to you on is made out of plastic. My computer is made out of plastic. The keyboard in front of me, the pen, I'm just looking around my office and the date stamper, the eyeglasses holder, some of the book binding around my office, the smoothie cup I'm drinking what remains of my lunch out of, my stapler, everything here, a bag of tea. All this plastic is a fairly recent development in our lifetime, and we're still learning more and more about it. So when I started studying plastic, one of the things that I found out is not, kind of in the back of my mind knew this, because at the time there was an Obama administration ruling that said no microplastic beads in cosmetics. So back then we had facial scrubs that had little bits of plastic that were a little bit abrasive, and also the same with toothpaste that would help rub some of the dead skin cells off, help rub some of the tartar off your teeth in the toothcase of the toothpaste. And they were seeing these microbeads in water supplies. So that was really when people started wondering what happens to plastic after we use it, besides just the big chunks of plastic strangling wildlife and things like that. At that time, I started looking into these microplastics and what are these microplastics. And there is microplastic associated with these old cosmetic products and toothpaste and things like that, but they turned out to be a really small minority of microplastics. And so I guess the next thing is, what exactly is a microplastic? And a microplastic is a piece of plastic that is less than half a centimeter in size. So 5 millimeters, what's that? Probably about 0.2 of an inch or something like that. Very, very small bit particles, but large enough that you can see them. Even just little O-rings in plastic jars and things like that, that's probably a terrible example. But anything about the size of a grain of rice or a lentil. And so most of the plastic that's in that, there is some that comes from products like the cosmetics, but there's also stuff that's actually made to be shipped to be made into other things. So when they make plastic, they'll make little tiny plastic beads about the size of peas, and they'll ship those to wherever they need to be, where they can be melted down and then made into other things. Those are called nurdles. They're little tiny bits of plastic. They're shipped all around the world. Sometimes we have shipping container accidents and they get poured into the ocean accidentally, stuff like that. So that can happen. But it turns out that most of the microplastic that's in our environment is from bigger pieces of plastic that broke. And we know that plastic doesn't biodegrade very well. That's why we like it, right? It's really sturdy and stable and flexible and light, and it doesn't degrade. So if you put something in a plastic container today and you come back a week later or a month later or a year later, chances are the plastic is still intact and you don't have a problem. But of course, the fact that it doesn't biodegrade, like something like cellophane, which is made out of vegetable or something like that, will eventually break down. That means it stays in the environment forever. And the reason you don't see it is because it breaks into many, many pieces. So a plastic bag that you use now, you might see the plastic bag and then eventually it gets, kind of looking moth-eaten and eventually it kind of disappears. It didn't really disappear. It's just that the bits of plastic are small enough that you really don't see them anymore. So these little bits of plastic are pretty much everywhere. They are in the ocean. They're in the water that you drink. They're in the food that you eat. They're in the soil. They're in wildlife. Pretty much most wildlife species, especially mollusks in the ocean, but because they're filter feeders, baleen whales are filter feeders, those kinds of animals, they can't really sort through the little daphnia and little water fleas and bits of algae and the plastic, so they end up taking it all in. So they are actually, it's in the food chain. It's in the human food chain, it's in the animal food chain, and it's out there. Where does clothing come in? Well, if you look at the labels on your clothing, and I've gotten really, really good at this, you can see what it's made out of. And I tend to go for the natural fibers, cotton, wool, occasionally silk because I love it. And even rayon is kind of a plastic, but it's a little more degradable than other plastics because it's made from vegetable sources like bamboo and things like that, plant sources rather than petrochemicals like regular plastic is often made out of. So plastic is made out of oil, basically, crude oil that goes through a whole lot of different processes before it's made into plastic. But, I mean, it's made out of fossil materials. So the more natural fibers, the cottons, the wools, and those kinds of things, the rayon and the plastic, so things like polyester, acrylic, when you put them in the washing machine, they break down a little bit and they shed material into the washing machine. They call it gray water. So the wastewater from your washing machine, if you've ever looked at it, especially if you wear a lot of denim and stuff like that, it looks kind of gray. Gray water, when it flushes out into the ocean or into the stream or into the lake or into the water treatment center, that has a lot of tiny particles of clothing. The tiny clothing fibers are actually considered to be about 7% of the microplastic that's in the waterways. So it's a significant contribution to plastic pollution. That may not be the case because it turns out that a lot of these studies were done using a microscope, and it's really hard to tell a fiber that's cotton from a fiber that's polyester in a microscope if you're not really good at it. Now they're using equipment like Fourier transformation, infrared spectrometers, and and they're actually looking at the chemical makeup of these fibers so they can distinguish this fiber is cotton and this fiber is acrylic and this fiber is polyester or whatever, like still about 50-50. So yes, some of it's natural fiber going out into the environment, some of it is this plastic. And water treatment centers do work on this. They take out about 99% of these fibers before they expel the water into water systems, lakes, and reservoirs and things like that. However, the amount of material that's shed from our clothing it's microscopic, but it's an enormous amount. I mean, we're talking 100 million fibers in a week's load of laundry or something crazy like that. I mean, just high numbers of little bits of fiber are going out into the environment. And so if you can get 98% of 100 million, you still have 2 million that are getting passed. So that's still a lot of fiber. And then to make matters worse, you take your clothes out of the washing machine and you do what? You put them in the dryer. And you put maybe a dryer sheet, which is made out of what, plastic, in with your clothes to tumble. And you've seen the lint trap. I mean, you've seen the lint trap in your dryer that's got all these little particles. So that gives you some idea of how much of these fibers are actually, that's only a portion of it. You know, a lot of it's already going out in the wash. But some of the stuff makes it through your filter, the very tiny particles, and they go out into the air. So now you're breathing them too. So now it's in your food, it's in your water, it's in the air that you breathe. And they've actually discovered that in cities, in metropolitan areas, there's a lot of plastic pollution actually in the air, and it's between fibers from clothing and tires, bits of tires. When there's a high traffic area, the tires do wear down and little bits of the tire can become aerosolized and kind of suspended as dust particles in the air. So that's another major source in some of these cities. So these things are everywhere. And now that brings us to the next question. What do they do? And that's where we really don't know very much. So do these plastics cause harm when we ingest them, when we breathe them, when we drink them in our water? Are they harming our bodies? Are they harming our pets' bodies? Our bodies are now partly plastic because these are in our food supply, these are in our air supply. So what are they doing to us? The general answer is we don't know. There are things that are used to make plastic more pliable, more sturdy, more this, more that. And those things might have effects on our bodies. They might be, for example, endocrine disruptors, they call them, which is when they affect the hormone system of your body, be it sexual hormones or even normal hormones that you need, like insulin. Do they affect diabetes? Nobody really knows. So we don't know what they're doing to our hormone systems with these potential endocrine disruptors. Some of them are small enough to permeate cells. We don't know if they're damaging our cells from the inside. We know that life comes in all different sizes. We have everything from tiny bacteria that you can see maybe with a very high-powered microscope, and then there's even things like mycoplasma that you need a super high-powered microscope to see. And we know that there's small organisms like Daphnia, the little water fleas we all grew up looking at under the microscope when you look in pond water and things like that, algae, little tiny single-celled organisms, small multi-celled organisms. These creatures have to eat, and they're finding that they can't really tell plastic from other food particles. So they're eating this plastic. Well, not a very large amount of plastic. So if we're eating a little bit of plastic in our diet, it's probably just passing through our bodies. And yes, plastic, we do know it's a component of human feces. It passes through our bodies. If you're tiny and 25% of what's supposed to be caloric intake is now plastic, which is not caloric, well, does that mean that you don't survive as well? Does it mean you don't reproduce as well? It's all really possible. And I actually had a colleague here who studied fish, and she looked at fish fry, the baby newborn fish, and their little intestines were full of plastic. So is it causing them to not get enough nutrition, even cause impactions? It could basically block the system so they can't eat anymore. So those are all possibilities. And we just don't know. And the other thing is these plastics are really, I'm trying to figure out how to explain the chemistry as easily as possible. But in chemistry, like attracts like. So if something, for example, oil and water, you mix oil and water or mix vinegar and water to make your salad dressing, and it separates. It always separates because they are different chemically. So the water, the vinegar are different from the oils. Because plastics come from oil, and remember it's a petrochemical, it attracts other things that are miscible in oils. And a lot of the insecticides we use and a lot of the chemical contaminants from back in the old days, like DDT, like PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. Now we're talking about the perfluorooctanoic acids, PFOAs, and other compounds like that from, the Teflon products and things like that. Those are fat soluble. Also, so are some heavy metals like mercury. So if they're fat soluble, they're plastic soluble. So if we're ingesting these things, is it possible that we're getting contaminated from them? We're getting small doses of contaminants when we eat those. Don't know. The other possibility, of course, is because the plastics do take up lipid-type substances, lipid-loving substances. Maybe they're taking them out of our body. Maybe they go through and they say, oh, there's a PCB molecule, I'm going to bind to that, and take them out. So we don't actually know. It could really go either way. Some other things that kind of follow. So we know that when big chunks of macroplastic break down to less than half a centimeter, less than 5 millimeters, we can call them microplastic. Okay. What happens when the microplastics break down? Because they don't biodegrade either. They don't reach some size threshold and then just kind of cease to exist. They just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So now they're talking about something called nanoplastic. And nanoplastic is much smaller than a human blood cell. I mean, it is not something you would see on a normal microscope. It's tiny. I mean, we're talking the size of a virus particle at this point. They're very, very small. So how are they interacting with our cells? I mean, they could definitely go back and forth through a cell membrane because cell membranes are fat. And as we know, plastic kind of likes to interact with fat. So it's something, that's something that's just coming into the scientific culture right now. What's it going to do? We don't know. But the other problem, of course, that we have is if you stop, and I try to avoid polyester. I try to avoid, I don't use much rayon, but I try to avoid polyesters and acrylics, even though I still have some clothes. Honestly, I have clothes from the 80s that are polyester that are still in perfect condition because it is, polyester is forever. But I'm trying to get back, but even if everybody stopped using plastic for anything, if you stopped using plastic grocery bags, if you stopped using plastic fibers, plastic clothing, polyesters, acrylics, all that stuff, it's still going to be here in 200 years because we have so much what they call legacy plastic that's already made. So that plastic isn't going anywhere. It's just getting broken down into smaller and smaller particles. And again, we don't know how those are interacting with our bodies. So that's kind of interesting. And when I was doing some research earlier this week for another presentation that I'm putting together, there's a bit of a COVID connection as well. I can actually work COVID virus into this conversation because one of the things that happened when COVID started taking off internationally in the United States, et cetera, is we started, of course, looking for ways to not get it. And one of the ways we found that's really effective in preventing us from getting it is wearing surgical masks. So they're actually finding surgical mask pollution, and surgical masks do contain synthetic fibers. And they're finding the surgical mask pollution all around the world right now. There was a recent paper, and I think it looked at Nigeria and Hong Kong to see how many plastic masks that had been thrown into the environment and were starting to break down they could find. And they found quite a few. And I think this is something that everybody understands, because I think pretty much anywhere in the United States you can walk out the door and find discarded plastic surgical masks and plastic gloves. They're just everywhere now. I live in the middle of the country. I have my closest neighbors are cows. And I was walking down the road and I found it wasn't actually the surgical mask, but it was a bag that said surgical masks on it. So they took the masks out and then just tossed the bag on the side of the road. But, just you can't walk across a grocery store parking lot without running into these masks anymore. So these are going to be legacy plastic for the next generation to deal with. Because like I said, once this plastic gets out in the environment, really, we don't have good ways of cleaning it up. And it's not going to break down under natural forces. So they're looking at ways. To clean it up. They're looking at bacteria that might like to eat it. But so far as we know, this plastic that we're putting out there is going to be found hundreds of years from now by archaeologists. They're going to probably wonder why we thought this was such a great idea.
Wow. Wow.
There's other really interesting stories about clothing and poisoning that I could tell you, but
yeah, shoot away. This is all it's blowing my mind.
Did you ever see there was a film called Elizabeth out years and years ago about Queen Elizabeth, about the first Queen Elizabeth the First? And I don't remember. It had like some really famous star. I don't remember who it was, but she played Queen Elizabeth. And one of the stories was that somebody had sent her a beautiful dress as a gift, and she found out her boyfriend was cheating on her because he loaned the Queen's dress to a handmaiden because he wanted to see her in it, and she died from arsenic poisoning. So the idea was that they had actually soaked the dress in arsenic. And then when somebody put it on, they died really fast from arsenic poisoning. And that really wouldn't happen that way. You can poison somebody with an arsenic garment. If you soaked a dress in arsenic and wore it or had somebody else wear it, they would eventually get arsenic poisoning. I don't think they'd drop dead as fast as this woman did. They'd probably get a really nasty rash, and they'd be really itchy and painful and eventually die. The ending of this poor woman was actually relatively merciful compared to what you would normally see in this. So this is actually something that they did use back in the Renaissance as a kind of a sinister way of murdering people. And if you ever actually have any interest in arsenic poisoning, she wasn't into couture so much as cosmetics, but there was this woman named Tofana in the 1500s, I believe, who basically produced cosmetics for women. And if you paid a little bit for her cosmetics, she would tell you how to make yourself more beautiful. And if you paid a little bit more, she would tell you how to get rid of men in your life that had outgrown their usefulness. And she was like a very early toxicologist. Her major brand was Agua Tofana. So she's super interesting, kind of an off the topic. But these things have been used, and the most recent case I've heard was not arsenic, but it was a pesticide called paraquat. Paraquat is a really dangerous pesticide that's used as a weed killer. It basically kills plants. I mean, it just kills them. And it's not really very easy to come by in the United States, thankfully, because it doesn't just kill plants, it kills pretty much a lot of stuff. It's really toxic stuff, really nasty. And this woman, I believe it was in China, her boyfriend, who was married to another woman, had apparently outgrown his usefulness. And she sent him a bunch of boxers that were soaked in paraquat. And he did die, but not until after he had a really, really horrible horrible rash. And I can't even imagine. They had there. If you look it up, there's actually pictures of this poor guy's rash. It was horrifying. I would not wish that on anyone. It was so bad. But so there are ways of poisoning people through their clothing. Not that I would recommend it, but it's really interesting things that people have done.
Wow, this goes beyond my imagination.
I know, right? Yeah, I learned so much stuff that I don't want to know as a toxicologist, but I also learned a lot of stuff that's super interesting.
Yeah, you mentioned that you have a little bit of a background in household products as well that might have an effect on household pets.
Yeah, a lot of the products that we use, especially cleaning products, laundry detergents, even fabric softeners, liquid potpourri that people put around their house with the infusers and things like that, dishwasher detergent. I'm sure you remember Tide Pods.
Mm-hmm. I do.
Yeah, the big Don't Eat Tide Pods campaign a few years ago. It's good, useful information that dogs are less susceptible to Tide Pods than people. And the reason is not that dogs will not try to eat Tide Pods, because some dogs will, and it will burn them, just like it burns the mouth of children that try to eat Tide Pods. But because of the way of the structure of the dog's mouth is different, they have a very kind of, most dogs, I mean, it might be a little different for a pug or something like that, but most dogs have kind of long snouts, and they're going to bite farther up, not with their canine teeth, but farther up in the mouth, so that the thing with the Tide Pods is they're really compressed. So there's a lot of liquid in a very small amount of space. And the reason it was a problem for children is when you bite into them, it releases the liquid kind of explosively. And so it would shoot into the back of the throat. And the back of the throat in the baby is pretty close to the front of the mouth. And so it would basically cause swelling there in the back of the throat. And of course, the esophagus, where the food goes down, is not that far from the trachea where the air goes down. So if you have swelling in the back of your throat, it's going to occlude your ability to breathe. So that's where some of the people that ingested the Tide Pods got into trouble. And that's where the children who ingest it thinking it's candy get into trouble. When dogs do it, it has a lot farther to go to hit the back of the mouth. So the good news is that they probably aren't going to get the severe respiratory effects that you get in a child that tries to eat a Tide Pod. The bad news is you still get the burns. Basically, detergents, this is actually ties in kind of nicely with the plastics, because plastics are lipophilic. They like fats. And detergents are made to get rid of fat, right? You remember, which was the dish soap that said takes grease out of your way? So basically what these detergents do is they break down the fat by attacking it with so they have one side of the molecule. These tend to be long molecules, and one side is water soluble and one side is fat soluble. So the fat soluble part sticks to the dirt on the clothing, and the water soluble part gets washed away in the water. So it basically takes that dirt off of your clothing and into the water. And that's how it works. And that's how the soap you use in your hands works. It's how the soap you use in your dishes works. It basically binds one end to the fatty stuff in the dirt, and the other end dissolves in water. And there's this whole really cool thing called a micelle that happens, which is kind of it looks like a starburst. It's where all of the parts stick to the molecules of dirt, and then the water-soluble parts surround it, and they form little balls, and they just basically get flushed out in the water when you rinse. So that's basically how detergents work. Well, it turns out that most of our cells have fat on the surface. So a cell is a bag of fluid and stuff. So it's mostly water, and in the water are things called organelles that do stuff, like the nucleus has the genetic material, and that's really important for the function of the cell and for reproduction of the cell. And then you have the mitochondria, which are the little powerhouses and all this stuff. So Intro to Cell Biology 101, the inside of a cell is water, and the surface of the cell is fat. So when your cells contact the detergent, it binds to the membrane on the surface of the cells, which are made out of fat, just like it would bind to the dirt. So that's why it's probably Unfortunately, I kind of have always had kind of a potty mouth, so I did ingest a lot of soap as a child. And my mother wasn't just like the put the bar of your soap in your mouth. She was like, bite into it. I want to see tooth marks when I pull it out of your mouth. So I did it. So, a small amount of soap ingestion probably not going to hurt you. A lot of these detergents, they cause damage to your tissues. They cause these chemical burns by dissolving the cells, literally dissolving the surface of the cells. That's a problem for animals that ingest something like bleach, which is a little bit different than normal detergents. But, a lot of the household detergents that actually are made out of detergent will cause, and like the stuff for your dishwasher, the powder for your dishwasher, that's another one. Laundry detergent is another detergent. So things that are detergents will cause tissue damage that way. The other thing that's interesting about pets is they don't tend to wash their hands all the time. So if you get something on the outside of a cat or a dog on its paws, it's going to end up inside that animal eventually because they're going to groom it off with their mouth. That's how they function, especially cats. Cats are really fastidious about that. They say cats aren't really clean. They're just covered in cat spit because they're constantly grooming themselves with their mouth. And one of the issues that we do see a lot in vet med is cats that walk through detergents or spilled fabric softener or some kind of material, a cleaning agent that is spilled on a surface. And probably the cat spilled it herself, let's face it. They saw that diffuser with the liquid potpourri in it, which is very similar to the detergents. They knocked it over because that's what cats do. There actually is a study that says cats actually do have a mind for physics, weirdly enough, but they're always doing little physics experiments to see about knocking stuff over, which is why I love cats. Cats are the best. But they knock stuff over and then they walk through whatever they spilled. And then you've probably seen a cat walk through something it doesn't like, and then they flick it off as much as they can, but that doesn't get it all off. So some of it they're going to ingest. So if you see a cat go through fabric softener or liquid potpourri or detergent that's spilled on a counter, you have to get it off of them with a lot of profuse amount of water, just a lot of water. Just rinse, 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 rinse. And the really important thing with cats and dogs is that the way their toes are structured, they kind of are kept together. They don't spread out their fingers like we do. They have their toes are kind of stuck together. So you have to make sure you get in between all of the toes really, really well with water, because if you don't, then you will get burns right in between where the toes contact each other, because that's where the detergent will stay. And super important, especially when you think about the way cat toes are structured, they have those toe beans. And if you don't get all the way around the toe bean, they're technically called pads, but everybody calls them toe beans because they're so stinking cute. So you got to get all the way around the toe beans, underneath the claws. You have to really soak their feet, and the cat is probably going to resent this for a very long period of time, but it will save a lot of heartache in the future if you just do it.
Do you see detergent-related poisoning in the lab often? Is that something that's kind of common?
I believe it is fairly common. Let me double check something. So I do diagnostics, and so basically we don't know really what killed this animal, or we think we know and we want to prove it. When it comes to soaps and detergents and things like that, people don't call me about it very much because it's usually pretty stinking obvious what happened. But there are 2 animal poison control centers, and I believe you talked to Anna Brutlag from one of them. And I'm just looking, the Pet Poison Helpline top 10. Pet Poison Helpline and the SPCA put out top 10 poisons every year, and I'm just looking it up to see where detergents fall on it. So top 10 dog poisons. Well, fertilizer make it, but household cleaners didn't on dogs. But on cats, household cleaners are number 3, and essential oils are number 5. So
wow.
Those are both things that would be interesting. And that makes sense, right? Because that's what cats like knocking stuff over. It's what they do. And they like climbing in counters, especially counters that they know they're not supposed to be on. When you tell the dog, don't do something, the dog's like, okay, don't do that. When you tell a cat, don't do something, the cat's like, don't do it while she's looking. So basically that's how these animals function. So it makes perfect sense when you think about it. So let's see what the top, that's 2018. Let's see if I can find 2019 for the SPCA. And you can look these up. They're really easy to find, obviously. Top 10, household products is number 6. So I would assume that that's going to include, let's see what it says about household products. 6. Household items remain at number 6. So they do it a little bit differently. So home improvement projects can expose animals to paint, adhesive, and spackle. Spackle? Huh. I've never had a spackle poisoning. So that's interesting to me. But yeah, so it doesn't really mention what specifically household products are, but I am guessing that that's a catch-all that includes detergents. Top 10 on both lists, more of a cat thing. So honestly, and this is really, really sad, but the ones that I'm aware of that were dog-related were usually abuse cases. So with the cats, it's the cats doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and with the dogs, it's usually somebody doing something to the dogs that they shouldn't be doing.
It's terrible. Do you think that there are, I wonder if there are alternatives to detergents for washing clothes and things like that that wouldn't be poisonous to animals?
That's a good question. I mean, we don't use fabric softeners at my house. My husband used to like the dryer sheets and stuff, but the polyester fibers in them, I just thought they were just a really bad idea, and there's no way to recycle them. So we stopped using those, and he got those little wool balls from Trader Joe's or whatever, and been using them. I don't know if they actually work. I don't think they actually work. But we put them in our dryer. I do a lot. Right now it's 90 degrees all the time, and he doesn't like me drying stuff outside because of all the pollen, so I just dry everything on clothing racks in the living room. So it's awkward when you have company, but we can't anyway because it's COVID. So so I use that. As far as detergents, I honestly don't know. I know around my house, I basically use bleach and vinegar, and those are like my go-to for just about, and a little bit of Bon Ami scouring powder, and that's it. So things that you can do, at least chlorine bleach is toxic, and it'll eat through your skin. And I know this because I could not find my plastic gloves when I was doing a deep cleaning of an apartment before I left, and so I'd use my hands, and the next day all the skin fell off of them. So I recovered. Yeah, I didn't. And last time I was bleaching around the house, I have the cell phone where it wants to take your fingerprint, and it couldn't find my fingerprint because I actually bleached it off.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So it's really good to use precautions when you're using these things because they do melt your skin. That's what they do because they melt those lipid membranes. So precautions are good. At least chlorine bleach does break down pretty well, and vinegar, of course, is not something you want to stick your fingers in when you have hangnails, but it's a natural product, and not that really makes any difference because botulism is natural too, arsenic is natural too, so it's kind of here or there, but it breaks down and doesn't cause a lot of environmental degradation. Of course, we used to use a lot of high phosphorus containing detergents for laundry and dishes, and that the gray water that went from that on a completely separate issue has massive water quality issues because high phosphorus water is a really good nutrient. It's basically the nutrient that is important for harmful algal blooms. And harmful algal blooms kill dogs and cats and cattle and people. So those are something that you don't want. Those are they're actually the freshwater harmful algal blooms that you probably heard about when I think it was the Toledo water system that was affected a few years ago by microcystin. So these organisms basically occurred in part because of farm waste, but in part because of the soaps that people were using and flushing out into the environment again. And these soaps produce nutrients, and these organisms, which are actually bacteria, so microcystis, Anabaena, all these little bacteria love phosphorus, so they would grow in huge numbers, and they would produce toxins that are really, really lethal. Sometimes I've heard of animals getting a few steps from the pond and dropping dead. So they're really nasty. You could make an argument that our laundry detergents have killed a lot of, and it's not just dogs and cats, it's cattle, it's wildlife. And there was actually an outbreak in Brazil many, many years ago where the reservoir had microcystis in it, and they were using the water in a kidney treatment center, and a lot of the people on dialysis actually died from poisoning. Humans find lots of ways to impact our environment, and many of them are not good ways, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm hearing a serious call to action on how we care for our clothes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just what we buy, it's how we wash them and care for them as
Yeah,
well.
it's really interesting because my co-speaker for later on this week, who we're doing a presentation on plastic for veterinarians, I was bouncing some questions off of her about clothing, and she's like, well, my main thing for clothing is reuse, reuse, reuse. So get everything from the thrift shop and things like that. I don't think she, I was like, well, yeah, but then you've got all these fibers going into the. So her point was that those clothes were already made and bought by somebody else. So you're just extending the life of something that's already out there. And like I said, I have clothes in my closet from the 1980s that are polyester that like still look like they're in mint condition because polyester never dies. So so yeah, that is a point, but then they shed so many of these microplastic particles into the water system, and until we find a better way of scrubbing them out of the water system and then figure out what to do with them afterwards, because they're always going to be there unless we figure out something that eats them or something.
Yeah, do we have a safe way to dispose of plastic?
Honestly, there isn't. There is, if you look, there is some recycling obviously that goes on. If you look at the UN did a big document about maybe 10 years ago or something about plastic in the environment, and it's actually a pretty awesome document because it's really easy to read and it's got lots of photos and graphs. Basically, what the European Union wants to do is put together a plan so that there is zero plastic waste by recycling everything and making things that are disposable now not disposable, because an awful lot of the plastic in the environment is the disposable stuff. They call it the single-use plastics. The whole plastic issue plays into environmental stewardship. It plays into food chain and food security. It plays into water resources. It plays into global climate change because of the petroleum connection. The world is so intricate, and nothing is ever as simple as you think it would be.
I wanted to ask you, are there any emerging technologies that you're excited about?
I honestly don't know that much about it. I think they are. I mean, I think they're doing stuff with clothing now that but might be a little bit more environmentally conscious. I remember, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, maybe longer, when they were talking about all those dark blue waterways in Mexico that were filled with chemicals from the denim manufacturer and things like that. And I think that we were getting, a little bit more. I think people, when they learn about these things, they basically discourage them, and it's in the corporate interest not to anger their customers by being really poor environmental stewards. And I don't know that maybe there's some empathy there at the CEO level for the environment and for the people that work there, but I suspect a lot of it is just empathy from the consumer. You can't make a living by upsetting your consumers. And I have worked with CEOs of companies that had recalls and things like that because of toxic problems. And they're human beings too. They don't want to poison their customers. They literally do not want to poison their customers, most of them, because even if they did, it's just bad business to poison your customers. It upsets people when bad things happen because of corporate irresponsibility. So I think the consumers do have power on their corner there. And if they ask for environmentally more safe products, the companies will respond. But we have to all ask for it, and we have to ask for it loudly. And we have to vote for it with our dollars, I think, to get their attention. This is a terrible, terrible old joke, but the story about the guy that was beating a mule on the side of the road, and the mule wouldn't move, so some guy came up and said, you can't get it to move by beating it. You have to be nice. And first thing he does is slap the mule in the face and then starts talking really nice to it. He's like, what did you do? I thought you said you couldn't get it to respond by beating it. And he says, well, yeah, but you have to get its attention first. So I don't recommend that in dealing with animals at all. But the idea is basically you have to get the corporation's attention that you don't want this anymore. I think there's some really neat technology. I mentioned rayon a couple times, and I don't wear a lot of it because I kind of don't like the way it feels. But there are new rayon technologies, and it's really affordable. They're making really affordable clothes with rayon, and they're making them out of things like bamboo and other plant materials. So those are a little bit more environmentally conscious. Of course, a lot of times they're using chemicals in the manufacture that might be a little bit more toxic. Like, I guess some of the plants have had really high hydrogen sulfide levels from the sulfur that they're using in their processing. I think that the technology is getting better, and I think that that as technology improves, the environmental footprint decreases a little bit, so that's all good. But of course, when you have, I don't know how many billion people are there in the world, 7 or 8 now. When you have that many people that need to be clothed and fed and have a clean environment, things are going to give. So it's tough. It's really tough. And when you have, honestly, I just went to a presentation was given by one of my former students she's somebody I actually adore. She's just a great, great person. But she was saying it's one thing to tell people that you should use renewables and be good to the environment, but some people don't care about that. They care about how they're going to make their money last till the next pay period, and if the polyester clothing is cheaper than the cashmere clothing, which it obviously is, they're going to buy the polyester clothing. And she didn't use that particular example, but you can see that is an example. So it's true, if you don't have money, you don't have power. And if you don't have money, it's hard to be conscientious when you have to eat. That just is what it always comes to. I actually heard a very wise man who did wildlife work in Africa, and he said, any man who can look at the beauty of a wild animal is a man with a full stomach.
Wow.
And it's true. I mean, I feel, the poaching industry, you look at it and you're like, how could they kill those beautiful elephants? And it's like, well, if I look at an elephant as a way to feed my entire extended family for 3 years, it looks a lot different than you looking at it as a thing of beauty. I mean, basically half of it is making the products that are more environmentally conscious, that have a smaller environmental footprint, a smaller carbon footprint, and all that stuff. But you also have to make it so people can buy it. You have to make it so that it's accessible to people. So accessibility is going to be the next thing. That's going to be super important. So I'm hoping that especially with like the rayon technologies, as those improve, it'll increase the accessibility of some of these semi-natural. I mean, they're not natural fibers, but they're semi-natural fibers. At least they're not made from petroleum products. So that's a benefit in my list of check boxes. Came from biological systems.
Yeah. Man, we have got to get rid of plastic.
Well, it does have benefits. There's got to be a way of dealing with plastic to keep its benefits but get rid of the bad stuff, and I think that's what the UN is trying to do. Hopefully the technology will catch up with our negligence one day.
Yeah, thank you
Have
so
a good
much.
afternoon.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, it was fun talking.
All right, I'll be in touch.
Ciao.
Bye. A huge thank you again to Karyn Bischoff for her passion and research to understand our animal friends, and for teaching us all about plastics and how harmful they can possibly be. I was literally in tears at one point. Okay, well, thank you for listening, and that's a wrap.
Hey, this is Andrea in Cedar City. ES Now is a Holding Court production and is written and produced by Courtney Barriger. Music is by Parker Ainsworth. Fact-checked by Justin Howard. And a special thanks to Alexandra Shuck.